I'm just saying this right up front, Uncle Wrecker may be my favorite thing in the Star Wars universe now. Hello interwebs and welcome to my review of the second episode of Star Wars The Bad Batch, Cut and Run. Up front, I have to say, I liked this episode quite a bit, but not as much as the premiere episode. I'll start staying spoiler-free for the most part with this sort of opening of this review, and then I'll get into spoilers, but sort of in that spoiler-free mode, I think this episode was kind of trying to do a little bit of establishing the dynamic and status quo for the series as it's moving forward. Episode 1 of this show really was like, okay, this is the big transition moment between the Clone Wars and the Galactic Empire era. And now that we're sort of in the meat of the show and sort of past that big premiere, the show kind of has to set up a new status quo with like, what are these episodes and what is this show going to look like going forward? And I think a lot of that is just sort of setting up like the fact that this team of the Bad Batch soldiers are going to be going from planet to planet, sort of dealing with the fallout of the Empire, and we're starting to see the Empire being built up and starting to set a new dynamic with all of the different characters in the show, sort of the biggest one being the sort of wrench of Omega. I keep wanting to say Omega or Omega because she says it as Omega because of her accent, but everyone else calls her Omega, so I'm not entirely sure which one I should do, but her saying Omega is adorable. I should just say that right up front. But yeah, especially with her dynamic in sort of a group of hardened soldiers. So that's sort of like the biggest dynamic change that they're really trying to establish here, and I feel like this episode kind of gave us a standard plot in terms of getting us through that with these sort of like, yeah, we're a bunch of hardened soldiers and you're a young little girl and we don't really want to have you on the team, but you're going to warm our hearts anyways and you're going to prove your usefulness. And it'll sort of like that sort of push and pull that you've seen in pretty much like every type of piece of media with this dynamic. And so I kind of was expecting that, and it's not by no means badly done. It's just exactly those plot beats that you would expect with this sort of episode. I think the biggest thing with that is that the relationship with Hunter and Omega kind of gets pushed to the forefront really quickly here, faster than I would have anticipated it being. I would have preferred kind of a little bit more of an establishment between those two and how those two have really started to form that sort of like father-daughter type relationship, which, by the way, it feels weird that their father-daughter relationship thing when they're technically like kind of the same person genetically. It's kind of an interesting questions going on there with that. But I don't mind that dynamic between the two of them. And even, in fact, in episode 1, I'm starting to get into spoiler stuff here now. In episode 1 of the show, I liked, and I called out in my review, the subtle little hints that Omega was looking up to Hunter, with like her copying his movements and mannerisms at several points, just subtly in the background in the way the animators animated it. Like they kept doing the same sort of things, and Omega sort of like looking up to Hunter and being like smiling at that. And it was just like a subtle piece that I really enjoyed. And I think that's a good dynamic to hone in on with those two. It gives Hunter, who feels like he's going to be kind of the de facto main character of this show, if, you know, I mean, all of them kind of are getting equal weight, but seems like he's going to be the real protagonist of the show. And so it kind of made sense for that dynamic to be built up, but immediately we're getting that storyline here of like, he wants to give her up so that she doesn't have to be put in danger, her caring for him. And while that's a perfectly fine storyline, like I said, you've seen it in millions of different types of media like this with this sort of storyline, I haven't really had the chance to feel them bond all that much. Like I could see that progression happening, but this story would feel a little bit more powerful if that dynamic had been a bit more firmly established. So when he tries to give her up towards the end of the episode with the clone family that we meet, which is also really adorable, I feel like I would have had a little bit more of a gut punch if I had really felt their relationship formed a little bit more, because again, everything else just sort of like was hitting these like standardized beats, like when Omega like runs out and gets into danger with that like weird alien animal thing, which like, how is a fence stopping that animal from getting by? But regardless, you sort of had that dynamic, like, oh, I want to protect you, you shouldn't, it's too dangerous for you to be here. Again, all stuff we've all really seen. But that being said, if the goal of this was to like get that established, like, no, Omega is part of this group now, she's going to be just as useful to them as any of the rest of them, even though she's a bit younger. I think if the goal of the show is just like, all right, let's just get this out of the way so that we can just really focus on like actually having Omega be part of this team, I can understand that. I can understand, like, this is a necessary plot beat. You kind of want to deal with it, and then now they can go and tell more interesting stories that kind of gets it out of the way. I still think it was a bit fast to get to this place, but it's one of those, like, I can understand the writers sort of being like, all right, let's get out of the way. The other part of this episode that I really liked, and I thought significantly worked a lot more, is what I'm actually coming to this show for, and that is sort of seeing the beginnings of the shift from the Republic into the Galactic Empire. And I like that we're seeing small little things happening throughout the Galactic Empire in this episode. One thing that I think is a bit fast that they do is like everyone just sort of got the Galactic Empire like costumes and uniforms right after the Republic fell. It's like, all right, well, the Republic fell, so let's break out all of our fascist uniforms. There's gonna be wearing the stormtrooper uniforms. We're just doing the full fascist thing now. Uniforms and looks are important parts of like fascist movements and like the aesthetic of like looking scary and fearful, but it just bothers me a little bit being like, wow, dang, they're like production capability in terms of uniforms was really, really quick. Someone just had that in a storeroom somewhere. But in terms of the actual episode, I really liked seeing the like small bits where we go to this sort of border planet and the Galactic Empire is starting to compound vehicles and starting to register people with numbers. I think that is exactly what a fascist society would do, try and make a registry of everybody and dehumanize people to just numbers and require them to use their numbers to be able to get stuff, taking away people's property and saying this belongs to the state now. All of that stuff rings really true, and I like seeing this sort of era of the Galactic Empire, sort of like seeing like how it became this sort of more fascist empire after the Republic, and the sort of shift that occurred, and sort of the trouble that people had to go through to sort of live in that changing society into something more authoritarian. So really cool stuff to see that here, and I also liked how that played out with the characters. Echo, for example, at one point in the episode when he's talking to Tech, says that, you know, clones fought so hard to, you know, have names, and now, you know, people are just being given numbers, even though that's what the clones had. And him sort of recognizing that, like, oh, we wanted to be seen as people, and people being given numbers in this fascist society is doing what we were. We're just being seen us as like a product, a thing that we can be wasted and used. It's sort of like this subtle emphasis on this dehumanization that things like fascist empires do. And I like that Echo is sort of expressing that, because I feel like the dynamic that Echo adds to the team is like he's sort of the everyman. The Bad Batch characters all seem like they have like some weird specific style to them, and Echo I feel like is probably going to be this character who's like, I'm just the everyday person on this team. I still feel like probably he is the least unique character within this show, and I feel like he might be a little bit, he runs the risk of being a bit of dead weight as the show continues, but I think if they play him as that regular everyman guy, I think it'll work, because I liked that his expressing of this sort of like concern over people being given numbers was actually interestingly mirrored by Tech, who actually appreciated that the fascist government was giving everyone numbers, because he sort of said, oh, well, it makes sense. And sort of Tech only seeing this through a utilitarian mindset, because he is someone who was like, oh yeah, I see things in numbers. And so I like that and this kind of goes through all the characters. I like that all the characters aren't like explicitly in the Bad Batch group explicitly like anti-empire specifically, that there are things that they're like leaning towards because they are soldiers, because they grew up in that environment. I think that sort of nuance is really cool to see. These aren't the rebels. These aren't the, you know, scrappy fighters, these sort of like Viet Cong equivalent sort of fighting the big empire. These are people who used to be soldiers for a very similar organization that fell into fascism. And so I like that the show is kind of giving these characters acknowledgements that like they're not 100% on the right in all of these things. And I like seeing that sort of subtle nuance with these characters within that. So I think as long as the show itself sort of remains on the side of like fascism bad, which given that we know the Empire's evil, I think that's fine. Seeing the nuance within these characters and like their agreements and disagreements within sort of like looking at that, I think is actually really cool to see, and a good nuance within all of this. Also, the other thing too with this is Uncle Wrecker. Wrecker's, I can already tell Wrecker's the best character in the show. Like, he's far and away adorable. Like, every single moment that he has within the show is wonderful. Like, when the kids, like, jump on him and they all know him as, like, the fun guy. And what his moments with Omega, which are actually, I actually felt a little bit more heartfeltness at Wrecker and Omega's small scenes than I did with Omega and Hunter. So I think Wrecker is just easily going to be my favorite of the show. I don't think many people would disagree with me. Maybe you do, but I feel like he's clearly the standout. So overall, I think this was a really solid episode. I liked liked it. I think it rushed a few things a little bit too much, but maybe in service of better things down the line in terms of like getting to more interesting stories. And I think that the use of this setting of just after the fall of the Republic and shifting into the Empire is fully being capitalized on in a really good way. And it is what I come for this series set at this specific time in the Star Wars universe. So excellent job there. So overall, liking it. But I'd love to hear all your thoughts. Did you like this episode of The Bad Batch? I'd like to hear that down in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to this channel where, this is After Dark, where the sexy gets nerdy and the nerdy gets sexy. I think that was the slogan that I'm kind of going with at this point. It's just where I get to dork out and talk about all the nerdy things that I love. I also have my main channel, Jessie Gender, as well, where I do more video essays and long-form discussions on nerdy topics as well. Oh, excuse me. I caught my throat in the middle of that. But anyways, I also have Patreon where you can support me. But beyond all of that, I hope that you, as always, live long and stay sexy.